I told my Amish husband I was pregnant. He asked, "Who else knew?" The pine floorboards in our kitchen always held the cold, long after the wood stove was lit. But that morning, the chill seemed to rise straight into my bones. I was 24 years old, and for 3 years, my life in the Middlefield district had been measured by silence. It was a silence I had tried to fill with the steady rhythm of baking bread, scrubbing pine tables, and sweeping the gray dust from the hearth. But on that October morning, as the autumn fog clung to the corn husks in the south field, the silence in our home changed. It became heavy, like the air before a summer storm. I stood by the window, my hands pressed flat against my apron, watching my husband, Isaac, as he sat at the long oak table. He was a quiet man, built of hard angles and weathered skin, his shoulders curved from years of behind the plow. When I finally cleared my throat and spoke the words I had carried in secret for 3 days, I expected him to drop his fork. I expected him to look up with the quiet joy of a husband who had waited years for an heir. Instead, his entire body went rigid. He did not look at me. He stared down at his plate, his fork suspended an inch above his eggs, and his voice was barely a whisper when he spoke. He did not ask when the baby was due, or if I was feeling well. He only asked one thing: who else knew? To understand why those words made the breath catch in my throat, I have to go back to the beginning of our marriage, to the day I moved my cedar chest into the farmhouse at the edge of the creek. Isaac was not a man of many words, but in our community, a quiet husband was often seen as a blessing. My mother had told me that a man who kept his thoughts to himself was a man who did not bring trouble home from the fields. My father had passed away the winter before, leaving me with our family's prime 60-acre parcel, the most fertile bottomland in the entire district. It was land that my grandfather had cleared with his own hands, bordered by ancient stone walls and a creek that never ran dry even in the hottest August. Because I was an only child, the deed to that land was my dowry, a heavy responsibility for a young woman of 21. When Isaac asked my uncle for my hand, it seemed like a natural, blessed match. Isaac's family farm bordered ours, and his mother, Martha, was a woman whose influence in the church was as solid as the limestone foundation of the meeting house. In the first year of our marriage, I believed I had found a safe harbor. Isaac was gentle with the horses and diligent with his chores. He never raised his voice, and when he looked at me, there was a kindness in his gray eyes that made the hard work of the farm feel lighter. But our house was never entirely ours. Every Tuesday and Thursday, the blue carriage of my mother-in-law, Martha, would roll up our gravel driveway. Martha was a tall, imposing woman who wore her black bonnet pinned with an exact, severe precision. She did not knock, she simply entered, her boots clicking sharply against the floorboards I had scrubbed the day before. She would walk straight to my pantry, running her fingers along the shelves to check for dust, or examining the jars of preserved peaches I had put up in the cellar. "A household that is not fruitful in its work will not be fruitful in its life, Rebecca," she would say, her voice smooth and cold as river ice. I would always nod and offer her tea, swallowing my pride. I trusted her because she was Isaac's mother, and because she was a deacon's widow who knew the ordnung of our district better than anyone. I told myself her constant supervision was merely her way of showing care, of guiding a young wife who had lost her own mother too early. But as the months turned into a year, and then 2 years, without any sign of a child, Martha's visits took on a sharper edge. She no longer spoke of the preserves or the garden. Instead, her eyes would linger on my waistline, and she began to bring small brown paper bags of dried herbs to our kitchen. A wife's primary duty is to build the home and provide the husband with inheritance, Martha told me one afternoon, placing a bag of gray, brittle leaves on the table between us. "This is wild carrot seed and blue cohosh. I have brewed it for many women in our family. It purifies the blood and prepares the soil, so to speak. You must drink a cup of it every evening before bed, Rebecca. Isaac needs to see that you are doing everything you can." I did not want to drink the bitter tea. It smelled of damp earth and rot, and it made my stomach churn after only a few sips. But I trusted Martha, and more than that, I trusted the structure of our life. In our district, the older women held the wisdom of the body. and to refuse her medicine would have been seen as a rebellion against the natural order of things. So, every night, under Martha's watchful eye or Isaac's quiet gaze, I would boil the water and drink the dark, bitter brew. Isaac never spoke of the tea, but he would watch me from his rocking chair by the stove, his face shadowed by the oil lamp. Sometimes I thought I saw a flicker of sadness in his eyes, a desire to reach out and take the cup from my hands, but he always looked away before I could be sure. I rationalized his silence. I told myself he was simply grieving our empty cradle in his own quiet way, that his masculine pride made it difficult for him to discuss such matters. I complied with his mother's demands because I believed that compliance was the only road to peace. By the second year, the pressure did not just come from within our walls. It began to seep in from the wider community. Our district's leader, Bishop Aaron, was a distant cousin of Martha's late husband, and his authority was absolute. He was a man with a gray beard that reached his chest, and eyes that seemed to look right through a person's skin to find their hidden sins. He began to make regular stops at our farm, ostensibly to discuss the yield of the south field or the maintenance of the communal drainage ditches. But inevitably, the conversation would turn. I remember one afternoon in late July, when the heat was so thick the locusts were screaming in the maple trees. I was serving cold mint water to Bishop Aaron and Isaac on the porch. The bishop took a long draught from his jar, wiped his beard with the back of his hand, and looked out over our green pastures. "The Lord has blessed this land with deep soil, Isaac," the bishop said, his voice deep and resonant. "But land without a lineage to tend it is like a lamp without oil. The church trust must always consider the future of our stewardship. Our community cannot afford to have 60 acres of prime bottomland fall into neglect or, heaven forbid, be divided and sold to the English if there are no heirs to claim it under our covenant." My heart hammered against my ribs as I stood in the doorway, holding the pitcher of water. I knew what he was referring to. Under our district-specific property guidelines, which my father had agreed to when he took over the deed, if a landowner died without direct heirs, or if the surviving family was unable to maintain a working household with children to carry on the agricultural covenant within 5 years of marriage, the stewardship of the land could be transferred to the church's community trust. The trust would then lease the land to another family, and the childless widow or couple would be moved to a smaller, communal cottage near the village, stripped of their independent holding. It was a rule designed to keep the colony's agricultural output high, but in practice, it felt like a ticking clock. "We are praying on it, Bishop," Isaac said quietly, his head bowed. "Prayer is the seed, but obedience is the water," Bishop Aaron replied, his gaze shifting to me as I stood in the shadow of the screen door. "And sometimes, the soil must be examined to see why it does not yield." That night, after the bishop left, I went to Isaac in the barn. He was brushing down our oldest mare, his movements slow and mechanical. The lantern light cast long, dancing shadows against the hand-hewn beams of the barn. "Isaac," I said, my voice trembling, "do you think we should go to the town? To the clinic near the highway? My cousin Sarah told me about a doctor there who helps couples who are struggling to have children. Perhaps there is a simple thing we do not know." Isaac stopped brushing the mare. He kept his back to me for a long time, his hand resting on the horse's flank. When he finally turned, his face was pale, his eyes wide with a fear I had never seen in him before. "No, Rebecca," he said, his voice uncharacteristically sharp. "We do not go to the English doctors. If the bishop hears even a whisper of us seeking worldly medicine for things that belong in God's hands, we will be put in the Red Book. We will be shunned. You must never speak of this again." "But the land, Isaac," I whispered, tears hot in my eyes. "The 5-year mark is only 2 years away. If we do not have a child, your mother and the bishop, they will take this house. They will take my father's land." "We must trust the Lord," Isaac said, but his voice lacked conviction. He walked past me into the dark yard, leaving me alone with the smell of hay and the heavy, silent weight of my own fear. It was during the following winter that the first real crack appeared in my trust. The winter of that year was exceptionally harsh. The creek froze solid, and the wind howled through the gaps in our old window frames. Because the roads were often impassable for the horses, Martha came to stay with us for 3 weeks to help with the winter butchering and quilting. One afternoon, while Martha was at the church sewing circle and Isaac was out checking the timber lot, I went into the small spare bedroom where Martha slept. I was looking for an extra set of wool blankets, but as I pulled open the bottom drawer of the old pine dresser, my hand brushed against something hard beneath the heavy quilts. It was a small, leather-bound ledger, its pages yellowed with age. It had belonged to Martha's late husband, the deacon. I knew I should not look. In our community, privacy was a sacred boundary, and looking through an elder's belongings was a serious transgression. But a strange, cold curiosity gripped me. I opened the ledger to the middle pages, expecting to see records of grain sales or church tithes. Instead, I found a list of names and dates written in the deacon's neat, sloping hand. The names were those of young families in our district over the last 30 years. Next to several of the names, there were small, red crosses. As I scanned the list, my eyes stopped on my own family's name, Miller, 60 Acres Bottomland. Beneath it, written in the same faded ink, were the names of my parents, followed by my own name, Rebecca, and next to my name there was a date, the date of my marriage to Isaac, and a single word written in German, Gemeinschaftsbesitz, community property. But what made my blood run cold was the note written directly below it, dated only 2 months before my wedding. The union is approved by the bishop. The stewardship will return to the trust as ordained. The line ends here. The line ends here. The words repeated in my mind like a bell tolling in the distance. Why would my father-in-law write that my marriage was approved with the expectation that the line would end? Why would they assume, before Isaac and I had even spent our first night under the same roof, that we would never have children? I closed the ledger and pushed it back beneath the quilts, my hands shaking so violently I could barely shut the drawer. I went back to the kitchen and sat by the stove, trying to make sense of what I had seen. I tried to tell myself it was a misunderstanding, that perhaps the deacon had simply been making a note about the legal structure of my father's estate. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it began to grow. The next day, I watched Martha as she prepared my evening tea. Her hands were old and spotted with liver spots, but they were incredibly precise as she measured out the dried gray leaves. I watched her spoon them into the teapot, her face calm and expressionless. "Drink it while it is hot, Rebecca," she said, setting the steaming mug on the table. "It does no good if it sits." For the first time in 2 years, I did not drink the tea. When Martha went to the pantry to fetch some flour, I quickly poured the dark liquid into a potted geranium that sat on the windowsill, leaving just a tiny drop at the bottom of the mug. I did the same thing the next night, and the night after that. Within a week, the geranium's leaves began to yellow and curl, turning black at the edges, before the plant withered completely and died. A cold, sickening dread washed over me. The wild carrot seed and blue cohosh Martha was giving me were not herbal remedies to help me conceive. I knew enough about wild plants to know that in certain quantities, and when prepared in a specific way, those very herbs were used by the old midwives to prevent a woman from holding a child. They were ensuring I remained barren. But why? Why would a mother want her own son's marriage to be childless? Why would a bishop who spoke so passionately about the sanctity of the land want our lineage to end? The answer began to take shape, and it was a ladder of betrayal that went higher than I had ever dared to look. If I remained childless, the 60 acres of prime bottomland, land that my father had kept independent from the church's communal holdings, would automatically revert to the church trust under the 5-year rule. The trust was controlled by Bishop Aaron and Martha's family. They didn't want Isaac to have an heir, because they wanted the land. And Isaac, my quiet, gentle husband, where did he stand in this? Did he know? Was he complicit in the theft of my family's heritage? I began to watch Isaac with a hypervigilance that bordered on madness. I looked for signs of guilt in the way he avoided my eyes, in his long hours in the fields, in the way he never questioned his mother's presence in our home. I felt completely isolated. I could not go to my neighbors. To accuse the deacon's widow and the bishop of poisoning my fertility to steal my land would have been seen as a delusional attack on the church leadership. I would have been shunned immediately, stripped of my home and my reputation before the week was out. Then, in the late spring, Isaac began to take weekly trips to the English town of Millersburg. He claimed he was going to buy specialty harness leather and iron fittings for the spring planting, but he would be gone for the entire day, returning long after the sun had set. One evening, after he had gone to bed, I went out to his buggy. In the small storage box beneath the seat, I found a white paper envelope. Inside was a receipt from a private medical clinic in Millersburg, a clinic that specialized in reproductive health. The receipt was made out to Isaac King. It was dated 3 weeks prior, and there was a handwritten note at the bottom from a doctor. Results of analysis confirm complete viability. No physical or biological impediment detected. Patient is fully fertile. My heart stopped. Isaac had gone to an English doctor. He had broken the strictest rule of our district, risking shunning and eternal damnation in the eyes of our church, to test himself. He wanted to know if he was the reason we had no child, and the results proved he was not. If Isaac was fertile, and if he had gone to the clinic in secret, it meant he did not know about his mother's tea. It meant he was not part of the conspiracy to steal my land. He was as much a victim of their manipulation as I was. He was desperately searching for answers in the English world, because his own mother and his bishop had convinced him that the childless marriage was a judgment from God on his own head. A wave of intense relief and love for my husband washed over me, followed immediately by a fierce, protective anger. Isaac was innocent. The man I had married, the man who had worked himself to the bone on my father's land, was not my betrayer. He was my ally, even if he did not know it yet. I kept my discoveries to myself. I continued to dump Martha's tea into the dead geranium pot, which I had replaced with a fresh plant of the same kind to avoid suspicion. I smiled at Martha when she came to visit, though every bone in my body screamed to throw her out of my kitchen. I waited, and I prayed, and then, in September, the change came. It began with a subtle tenderness in my breasts, a morning tiredness that did not disappear after my first cup of coffee, and a strange, metallic taste in my mouth. I waited until my cycle was 3 weeks late before I dared to believe it. I went to the dry goods store in town, the English store where nobody knew my name, and bought a small plastic testing stick. I hid it in the sleeve of my winter coat, and that night, while Isaac slept, I took the test by the dim light of a single candle. 2 pink lines appeared in the small window. I was pregnant. Against all the odds, against the bitter herbs and the quiet schemes of the elders, a new life had taken root inside me. I sat on the cold floor of the bathroom, tears streaming down my face, holding the small plastic stick against my chest. It felt like a miracle, a direct sign from the heavens that my father's land and my own body were not meant to be sacrificed to the greed of Martha and the bishop. But the joy was short-lived. The realization of what this meant descended on me like a suffocating blanket. In our community, my pregnancy would not be seen as a simple blessing. It would be seen as a direct challenge to the plans that had been set in motion before we were even married. If Martha and the bishop knew I was pregnant, they would know their scheme had failed. They would know I had stopped taking the herbs, and they would look for a way to discredit the child, to discredit me. That brought me to that October morning in the kitchen. The steam rose from the coffee pot on the stove, and the kitchen smelled of wood smoke and frying eggs. Isaac sat at the table, his fork hovering in the air, his face pale and frozen. "Who else knew?" he asked again, his voice cracking slightly, as he finally looked up at me. His gray eyes were wide, not with anger, but with an absolute paralyzing terror. I walked over to the table and sat down opposite him. I did not reach for his hand. I kept my hands folded in my lap, keeping my voice as calm and steady as I could. "Nobody, Isaac," I said. "No one knows but me. And now you." Isaac let out a long, shuddering breath, his shoulders dropping as if a massive physical weight had been placed upon them. He set his fork down on the plate with a small clatter. "Why do you ask me that, Isaac?" I asked quietly, leaning forward. "Why is your first question about who else knows that we are finally going to have a child? Shouldn't we be praising God?" Isaac looked toward the window, his eyes darting to the gravel driveway, as if he expected his mother's carriage to appear at any moment. He rubbed his face with his calloused hands, his chest heaving. "You don't understand, Rebecca," he whispered, his voice so low I had to strain to hear it over the crackle of the wood stove. "If my mother finds out, if the bishop finds out, they will not let us keep this child. They will not let us keep this farm." "Why?" I pressed, my heart beating fast. "Why would they want to harm our child?" Isaac looked at me, and for the first time in our marriage, the wall of silence between us crumbled completely. The truth came spilling out of him in a desperate, quiet rush. 3 years ago, before we were married, my mother and Bishop Aaron sat me down in the church study, Isaac said, his eyes swimming with unshed tears. "They told me that my father had made a quiet agreement with your father before they passed. They told me that because of a family weakness on my father's side, a sickness that had taken my older brothers before I was born, I was likely sterile. They said it was God's will that our line should end with me." I stared at him, my mouth slightly open. "They told you that you were sterile?" "Yes," Isaac nodded, a tear escaping and running down his dusty cheek. "They said that they were allowing the marriage only because your father's land needed a strong man to work it until the 5-year covenant expired. They told me that if I accepted this, if I kept the secret and worked the land faithfully, the church would provide for us when the land reverted to the trust. They said it was my penance for my family's sins." "And you believed them?" I asked, my heart breaking for the young man who had carried that shame alone for 3 years. "I had no reason not to," Isaac said. "They are the elders. They are my mother and my bishop. But then, as the years went on, I saw how much you wanted a child, Rebecca. I saw you drinking that bitter tea every night, trying so hard, and my heart was torn in two. I went to the English doctor in Millersburg. I risked everything to see if there was some mistake. And the doctor, he told me I was healthy. He told me I could have children." "I know," I said softly, reaching into my apron pocket and pulling out the medical receipt I had taken from his buggy, along with the small plastic pregnancy test. I laid them both on the oak table between us. Isaac looked at the receipt, then at the test. He gasped, his hand flying to his mouth. "You found it," he whispered. "Yes," I said. "And I also found your father's old ledger in Martha's drawer. I found the notes about our land. And I found out that the tea your mother has been forcing me to drink for 2 years was not to help me conceive. It was wild carrot seed, Isaac. She was secretly making sure I remained barren so they could claim my father's bottomland for their own families." When the 5-year mark arrived, the silence that followed was different from any silence we had shared before. It was the silence of a structure collapsing, of a lifetime of conditioning, and trust shattering into 1,000 pieces. Isaac stared at the pregnancy test, his face moving through a sequence of emotions, from shock to comprehension, and finally, to a deep, terrible anger that made his knuckles turn white as he gripped the edge of the table. "My mother," he whispered, the word tasting like poison in his mouth. "My own mother did this to us." "She did," I said, my voice steady, "and Bishop Aaron was with her every step of the way. If we go to the community with this, Isaac, if we tell them I am pregnant, they will not believe us. Or worse, they will accuse me of being unfaithful to you. They will say the baby cannot be yours, because they still believe, or want the community to believe, that you are sterile. They will use their authority to ruin us, to take the baby, and to take the land." Isaac looked up at me, his gray eyes clear and focused in a way I had never seen before. The quiet, passive boy who had spent his life obeying his mother and the elders was gone. In his place stood a father, a husband who had finally seen the boundary of his own endurance. "They will not touch you," Isaac said, his voice dropping to a hard, resolute register. "And they will not touch our child." "What do we do, Isaac?" I asked, the fear returning now that the truth was out. "The 5-year mark is coming. Martha will be here tomorrow. She will expect me to drink the tea." "You will not drink another drop," Isaac said. He stood up, walking to the window, and looking out over the 60 acres of golden corn that lay waiting for the harvest. "We have only one choice, Rebecca. We must leave." "Leave?" The word felt massive, terrifying. To leave the Middlefield district was to leave the only world I had ever known. It meant leaving the graves of my parents, the church where I was baptized, and the language of my childhood. It meant stepping into the vast, chaotic English world with nothing but a suitcase and the clothes on our backs. The deed to this land is in your name, Rebecca, Isaac said, turning to face me. Under the English law, the church trust has no claim to it until the 5-year mark, and even then, only if we remain here and allow them to enforce their covenant. If we sell the land to an English buyer now, before the bishop can file any papers with the county clerk, we will have enough money to buy a farm of our own, far from here, in Ohio or Missouri, where they cannot find us. But the shun, Isaac, I whispered. We will be dead to everyone we know, your mother, your family. Isaac walked over to me, kneeling beside my chair. He took my hands in his grip warm and solid. My mother chose 60 acres of dirt over her own son's happiness, he said, his eyes filled with a quiet, burning resolve. She is no longer my mother, Rebecca. Our family is here, in this room, in you and in this child. We will build a new home, where the soil is not watered with lies. The next 3 weeks were a blur of quiet, desperate preparation. It was a dangerous game. Under our community's rules, any sign of a family preparing to leave, such as selling off livestock or packing large boxes, would be reported to the bishop immediately, resulting in an instant shunning and the locking of our property. We had to make everything look entirely normal. Every day, I went about my chores. I swept the porch, I washed the clothes, and when Martha came on Tuesdays, I greeted her with the same quiet nod. When she handed me the steaming mug of herbal tea, I took it, held it to my lips until she turned her back to check the bread, and then poured it down the sink drainage pipe that Isaac had secretly modified to empty directly into the flower bed outside, rather than the cellar drain. Meanwhile, Isaac was making quiet weekly trips to the English town. He met with an English real estate agent, a man who understood the value of 60 acres of prime bottomland with its own water source. Because the land was highly coveted by the local dairy operations, an offer was made within 10 days. A cash offer that was more than enough to buy a beautiful, 100-acre farm in the rolling hills of southern Ohio, far outside the reach of our district's elders. The signing of the deed was set for the second Tuesday of October. It was the same day as the autumn communion service, the one day of the year when the entire district would be gathered inside the meeting house for 6 hours of intense prayer and confession. It was the perfect, and only, window we had to escape without being noticed. On the morning of the communion, the air was crisp and clear, the ground covered in a silver frost that melted as soon as the sun hit the fields. I dressed in my finest Sunday dress, pinning my white cape and apron with steady fingers. Isaac wore his clean black suit, his beard neatly trimmed. We looked like any other young Amish couple preparing to take the sacrament. We drove our buggy to the meeting house, parking it in the rear of the grove of maple trees. As we walked toward the heavy wooden doors, Martha met us on the path. She looked at my waist, her eyes narrowing slightly, then looked up at Isaac. "Have you been praying, Isaac?" she asked, her voice low. "The bishop will be speaking on stewardship today. It is a message you both need to hear." "We have prayed, Mother," Isaac said, his voice entirely calm. "We have found our peace." Martha nodded, satisfied, and walked inside. We sat through the first 2 hours of the service. The room was hot, filled with the smell of wet wool and pine shavings, the voices of the congregation rising in the old, slow German hymns. I sat on the women's side, my hand resting gently on my stomach beneath my apron, feeling the faint, quiet thrum of the new life within me. Across the center aisle, Isaac sat on the men's bench, his eyes fixed on the pulpit. At precisely 11 o'clock, during the long silent prayer where the congregation knelt on the floorboards with their heads bowed, Isaac and I quietly rose. In the sea of hundreds of bowed heads, our movement was almost imperceptible. We slipped out of the side door of the meeting house, our boots making no sound on the soft pine needles of the grove. We did not take our buggy. The sound of the iron tires on the gravel road would have alerted the deacon who sat watch in the carriage shed. Instead, we walked quickly through the woods, following the narrow deer path that led to the highway 2 miles away. In the shadow of a large oak tree near the asphalt road, A gray English sedan was waiting. It was the real estate agent, who had agreed to drive us to the county seat, to sign the final papers, and then carry us to the train station. As I climbed into the back seat of the car, I looked back one last time at the valley. I could see the red roof of my father's barn rising above the trees, and the blue ribbon of the creek winding through the bottomland. It was the land where I had taken my first steps, the land where my father had taught me to plant seeds, the land that had nearly cost me my husband and my child. I felt a sharp tear run down my cheek, but as Isaac sat down beside me and took my hand, his grip was firm and dry. "Do not look back, Rebecca," he said softly. "The seed is sown. Now we must let it grow." That afternoon, in a dusty county office with yellow walls, I signed my name to the English deed, transferring the 60 acres of bottomland to a dairy farmer from the neighboring county. The money was wired to a bank account Isaac had opened in Millersburg, a secure holding that no church trust could ever touch. By the time the communion service ended in the Middlefield district, and by the time Martha and Bishop Aaron realized our buggy was still in the grove but we were gone, we were already on a train heading west toward Ohio. The shunning was announced the following Sunday. My cousin Sarah, who secretly wrote to me through an English friend's address 2 years later, told me that Bishop Aaron's voice had shaken with anger when he read our names from the Red Book. Martha had sat on her bench, her face like stone, refusing to speak our names to anyone in the district. They had tried to contest the sale of the land in the county court, claiming the church covenant took precedence over the deed, but the English judge had thrown the case out within 10 minutes. The bottomland belonged to the dairy farmer, and the church trust had lost its prize. It has been 12 years since that October morning in the kitchen. We live now on a rolling hill farm in southern Ohio. Our house is white with blue shutters, and there is a large swing beneath the ancient oak tree in our front yard. We still live a simple, plain life. We do not have a television or a telephone in our home, and we still speak the old German tongue when we sit down to supper. But we are free. Our daughter, Sarah, named after the cousin who kept our secret, is 11 years old now. She has her father's quiet, thoughtful gray eyes, and my father's love for the soil. Sometimes, when the autumn fog clings to the hills and the pine needles smell of damp earth, I watch her running through the orchard, her laughter ringing out across the valley. Isaac still does not speak many words, but when he looks at her, and when he looks at me, his eyes hold a peace that is deeper than any silence. I carry no bitterness in my heart for the woman who raised him, or for the bishop who sought to take our heritage. I have come to understand that in their world, fear had become their master. Fear of losing their control, fear of the changing world, fear of the future. They believed that to protect their tradition, they had the right to sacrifice the lives of the young. But we have learned a different truth on this hill. We have learned that tradition is not a cage, and obedience is not love. Sometimes, the only way to save the seed is to carry it away from the old field, into a new soil, where it can finally reach for the sun. And every evening, as I tuck my daughter into her bed and look out over our quiet, fertile land, I know that the line did not end. It simply found a better place to begin.